When the lawyer handed over a mouldy, leather-bound diary, the room erupted in laughter. Her wealthy cousins inherited millions. She got an old woman's unhinged ramblings. They called her the family joke. But they didn't know that the final page held a secret worth more than the entire estate. The mahogany-panelled office of Arthur Pendleton, Esquire, smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The ticking of a brass grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. Clara Higgins sat on the edge of a stiff leather chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, acutely aware of the frayed cuffs of her waitress uniform, hidden beneath a cheap trench coat. To her left sat her Aunt Caroline, draped in an oversized mink coat, despite it being a mild Tuesday in October. Caroline reeked of expensive gin and heavy designer perfume, her lips pursed tightly together as she eyed the lawyer. Beside Caroline was her son, Clara's cousin, Ronald. Ronald was a 30-something tech bro who had burned through 3 trust funds on failed app startups, yet he wore a smug, entitled grin, constantly checking his heavy Rolex watch and tapping his Italian leather loafers against the Persian rug. They were all there for the final estate reading of Great-Aunt Bella. Bella Higgins had been the eccentric phantom of the family. She lived in a sprawling, decaying Victorian mansion on the rocky cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island. For the last 2 decades of her life, the rest of the family treated Bella like a contagious disease. Caroline claimed the old woman had completely lost her mind, wandering her overgrown rose gardens in a tattered silk bathrobe, muttering to the seagulls. Ronald only visited her when he needed seed money, which she always sharply denied. Clara, however, had genuinely loved the old woman. For the past 5 years, while drowning in $60,000 of student debt and working double shifts at a local diner, Clara was the only one who drove up the coast every Sunday. She didn't ask for money. She simply brought Bella fresh Earl Grey tea, helped her prune the overgrown hedges, and listened to her wild, winding stories about the Newport high society of the 1960s. Arthur Pendleton cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Let us begin. I have the final testament of Mrs. Bella Eleanor Higgins. Ronald leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed greed. Let's skip the preamble, Arthur. We all know why we're here. Just tell us how it's divided. Pendleton shot Ronald a withering look before turning back to the heavy parchment. Very well. To my niece Caroline, I leave the Newport estate, including all land fixtures and antique furnishings therein. Caroline let out a dramatic, breathless sigh, pressing a hand to her chest. Oh, thank heavens. I'll have that decrepit eyesore leveled and sold to developers by Christmas. Do you know what oceanfront acreage goes for these days? Furthermore, Pendleton continued, his voice monotone. To my great-nephew Ronald, I leave my entire portfolio of stocks, bonds, and liquid assets held at the First Trust of Providence, totaling approximately $4.6 million. Ronald pumped a fist in the air. Yes, finally. I'm telling you, Mum, my crypto exchange idea is finally getting off the ground. Clara swallowed hard. She hadn't expected millions. She hadn't expected the mansion. But as the sheer scale of her cousin's inheritance washed over her, a desperate, tiny flame of hope flickered in her chest. She was 3 months behind on rent. The engine in her 10-year-old sedan was knocking dangerously. Even a few $1,000s, just enough to clear her debt and give her a month to breathe, would change her life. She looked up at Pendleton, her heart pounding against her ribs. The lawyer hesitated. He looked at Clara, and for a fleeting second there was a flash of deep sympathy in his eyes. He looked back down at the document. And finally, to my great-niece, Clara. Pendleton paused, taking a breath. To Clara, who never asked for a dime, but gave me the only genuine kindness I experienced in my twilight years. I leave my most prized possession, the record of my life's true work. Pendleton reached into the desk drawer and pulled out an object. He didn't slide over a check. He didn't hand over a deed. He handed across the mahogany desk a thick, battered, dark brown leather diary. The spine was cracked, the leather peeling at the corners, and it was held shut by a tarnished, broken brass clasp. Clara stared at it. The room went dead silent for a count of 3. Then Ronald barked out a laugh. It was a cruel, echoing sound that bounced off the wood panels. Caroline joined in a high-pitched, mocking cackle. "A diary! Oh, my word! She left the waitress a diary!" Caroline wiped a tear of mirth from her eye. "I always told you she was completely insane, Ronald. A diary of what her conversations with her feral cats." "Hey, Clara," Ronald snickered, leaning over to poke the cracked leather cover. "Maybe if you take it down to the antique shop on Main Street, or they'll give you $5 for it. That should cover your bus fare home." Humiliation burned hot and fast in Clara's cheeks. Her face flushed crimson. She felt the sting of tears threatening to spill, but she fiercely clamped down her jaw. She would not cry in front of them. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Mr. Pendleton," Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Is that all?" "I am afraid so, Miss Higgins. That is the entirety of the bequeathment directed to you." Clara stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. She reached out with shaking fingers and picked up the diary. It was surprisingly heavy, smelling of dust, mildew, and dried lavender. "Don't spend it all in one place, Clara," Ronald called out as she turned toward the door. "If you want, I can hire you to clean the Newport house before the demolition crew comes in," Caroline added, entirely devoid of irony. "Minimum wage, of course. Keep it in the family." Clara didn't answer. She clutched the old book to her chest, pushed open the heavy oak door of the office, and walked out into the pouring autumn rain, leaving her laughing relatives behind to count their millions. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Clara unlocked the deadbolt to her tiny, damp basement apartment. The radiator clanked angrily, doing very little to chase away the October chill. She threw her wet coat over a kitchen chair, sank onto her thrift store sofa, and dropped the old leather diary onto the coffee table. She sat there in the dim light of a single-floor lamp, staring at it for a long time. The anger and humiliation from the lawyer's office had faded into a hollow, crushing sense of defeat. She felt entirely alone. It wasn't just about the money. It was the betrayal. Why would Bella do this? Clara had sacrificed her rare days off driving hours out of her way to care for an old woman who apparently thought a crumbling notebook was a fair reward for years of devotion. Maybe Caroline was right, Clara whispered to the empty room. Maybe she was just a crazy old bat. With a sigh, Clara reached out and flipped the diary open. The binding groaned. The pages were yellowed stiff and filled with Bella's looping, erratic, cursive handwriting in faded blue ink. Clara started to read, hoping against hope that there was a hidden check pressed between the pages. Nothing. Instead, the pages were filled with tedious, nonsensical daily logs. April 4th, 1982. The blue hydrangeas are thirsty. I walked 42 steps from the porch, counted 7 birds. The soil is too alkaline. August 12th, 1985. Baked a lemon tart. Oven at 350. The grandfather clock chimed 14 times. Digging near the old oak. 8 inches down. Clara flipped through dozens of pages. It was all the same. Ramblings about the weather, repetitive mentions of baking temperatures, and an obsessive documentation of how many steps she took around her garden. It was the tragic written manifestation of a brilliant mind slowly deteriorating into dementia. For 3 days the diary sat on her table. For 3 days, Clara went to the diner, served greasy burgers to ungrateful tourists, and tried to figure out how she was going to pay her electricity bill. On Thursday evening, A bright pink final disconnect notice was taped to her apartment door. The dam finally broke. Clara walked inside, ripped the notice in half, and let out a scream of pure frustration. She grabbed the leather diary off the table and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the brick wall with a loud crack and tumbled to the floor, coming to rest near the radiator. She collapsed onto the rug, pulling her knees to her chest, and finally let herself cry. She cried for her empty bank account, for the cruel laughter of her cousins, and for the fact that she had wasted years loving an old woman who had left her nothing but madness. After 10 minutes, the tears dried up. Clara sniffled, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. She looked over at the diary. When it had hit the wall, the impact had completely split the back cover. The thick leather binding had cracked open, revealing that the heavy backboard of the book was actually hollow. Clara frowned. She crawled over to the radiator and picked up the book. The back cover wasn't just thick leather. It was 2 separate pieces of stiff parchment, tightly glued together, wrapped in leather. The force of the throw had shattered the brittle 50-year-old glue. Her heart gave a strange, erratic thump. She slid her fingernail into the crack, carefully peeling the thick parchment layers apart. Hidden perfectly inside the hollowed-out back cover was a flat brass skeleton key and a single pristine white envelope. Clara's hands shook as she pulled the envelope out. On the front, in clear, steady, perfect handwriting, nothing like the erratic scrawl in the rest of the journal, it read, "To Clara. The only one who saw me, not my bank account." She ripped the envelope open and pulled out a crisp sheet of stationery. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have survived the absolute circus that was the reading of my will. I can only imagine the sheer delight on Caroline and Ronald's faces when they took the estate and the stocks. I sincerely hope they enjoy them. Because the Newport estate is condemned due to black mold and structural rot that I have been covering up for a decade, and the First Trust stock portfolio was heavily leveraged against a series of bad maritime investments I made in the 90s. Ronald just inherited about $4 million of corporate debt." Clara let out a gasp, a sudden shocked laugh escaping her lips. "I am not crazy, Clara," the letter continued, "but it was incredibly useful to let my greedy vultures of a family believe that I was. It kept them away, and it kept my true legacy safe. My late husband, Arthur Sr., did not make his fortune in textiles as the family believes. He was a private collector of rare antiquities. When he died, I liquidated his most valuable pieces, an entire vault of 18th century uncirculated gold bullion and several flawless Colombian emeralds. I didn't put this wealth into banks where the government or my terrible niece could find it." Clara felt the room spinning. She set the letter down on her lap, taking a deep, shuddering breath before picking it up again. "The diary you hold is not a gardening log. I knew you were smart enough to look closer. The plants are distractions. The numbers are a cipher. The temperatures, the steps, the birds, they are geographical coordinates and combination numbers. The brass key in this cover opens a private off-the-books lockbox at the old Providence Maritime Union. But you need the exact coordinates of the vault room and the combination to the inner safe. Read the diary again. Follow the numbers, not the flowers. Do not trust Pendleton, he knows nothing. Do not let Caroline know you have this. Find what is yours, Clara. Change your life. With all my love, Aunt Bella." Clara stared at the letter. She looked at the brass key resting in her palm. It felt heavy. It felt like power. She scrambled over to the couch, grabbing a notebook and a pen. She opened Bella's diary to the first page. April 4th, 1982. The blue hydrangeas are thirsty. I walked 42 steps from the porch, counted 7 birds. 42. 7, Clara muttered, scribbling the numbers down. She flipped the page. August 12th, 1985. Baked a lemon tart. Oven at 350. The grandfather clock chimed 14 times. Digging near the old oak, 8 inches down. 350. 14. 8. The erratic ramblings of a mad woman were gone. In their place was a meticulously crafted treasure map, hiding in plain sight. Clara spent the next 5 hours locked in her apartment, ignoring the cold, ignoring her hunger. Page by page, she stripped away the fake gardening notes, extracting a long sequence of numbers. By 3 a.m., she had a complete sequence. 41 degrees, 49 minutes, 25 seconds. North, 71 degrees, 24 minutes, 14 seconds. West. Box 814. Combo 42-17-35. She pulled up the map application on her cracked phone and typed in the coordinates. The red pin dropped precisely onto an old industrial waterfront district in Providence, Rhode Island, right on top of an unmarked brick building registered to the Historical Maritime Union. Clara looked at the brass key. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. Her cousins thought they had won. They thought they had left her with garbage. "Okay, Aunt Bella," Clara whispered into the quiet room. "Let's go find your real inheritance." Little did Clara know her cousin's new wealth was already collapsing, and Ronald, desperate to find anything of value, had just realized that Aunt Bella's antique collection was entirely missing from the Newport house. And he was already trying to figure out where it went. The early morning bus to Providence rattled over the uneven pavement of Interstate 95, the grey Rhode Island sky mirroring the tense electric anticipation in Clara's chest. The leather diary was wrapped tightly in a plastic grocery bag shoved at the bottom of her faded canvas tote. She had barely slept. The brass key felt like a burning ember against her thigh through the fabric of her jeans. 60 miles away, in the polished glass and steel offices of the First Trust of Providence on Weybosset Street, the illusion of Ronald's newfound wealth was violently shattering. Ronald sat opposite Harrison Cole, a senior wealth manager with a perfectly tailored suit and a deeply uncomfortable expression. Ronald had swaggered into the bank at 9 a.m. sharp, demanding to transfer $2 million of his inherited portfolio into his personal checking account. "I am sorry, Mr. Higgins," Cole said, pushing a thick stack of printed financial statements across the mahogany desk. "As I tried to explain over the phone yesterday, you cannot liquidate these assets. In fact, the bank is currently preparing to seize them." Ronald's smug smile vanished. "Excuse me, that's my money. Arthur Pendleton read the will. $4.6 million in stocks and bonds." "That is the gross valuation of the assets." "Yes," Cole replied, adjusting his tie. "However, your great-aunt Bella Higgins leveraged those assets extensively starting in the late 1990s. She took out massive loans against the portfolio to fund a series of high-risk offshore maritime ventures that entirely collapsed. With the accumulated interest, the estate's debt currently stands at just over $6 million. Ronald felt the blood drain from his face. The room suddenly felt incredibly hot. "Debt, no. She was crazy. She didn't know what she was doing." "Mrs. Higgins was entirely lucid when she restructured these accounts, sir. She signed the margin agreements herself. By accepting the inheritance of her financial portfolio, you have also legally assumed the liabilities attached to it. First Trust of Providence will be initiating collections by the end of the week." Ronald stumbled out of the bank 10 minutes later, his vision blurring. He was practically hyperventilating. He pulled out his phone and dialed his mother. "Mum, the money is gone." Ronald choked out the moment Caroline answered. "It's all debt. She saddled me with millions in corporate debt." "What are you talking about?" Caroline shrieked through the receiver. Her voice was frantic, layered with the sound of power tools in the background. "Ronald, you have to wire me cash right now. The city inspector just left the Newport house. It's not just a black mold. The entire foundation is structurally compromised by ocean rot. The city is condemning the property. They told me I have to pay $300,000 out of pocket for hazardous demolition and soil remediation, or they're putting a lien on my own house." Ronald stopped dead in his tracks on the crowded sidewalk. Bella had known. The crazy old bat had known exactly what she was doing. She had intentionally handed them a poisoned chalice. Then a cold, terrifying realization hit him. The diary. Bella hadn't left everything to them. She had left her most prized possession to the waitress. The diary wasn't a joke. It was the only thing of actual value. "I'll call you back," Ronald snapped, hanging up the phone. He knew Clara worked at a diner in South Kingstown. He knew she drove a beat-up blue sedan. Desperation clawed at his throat. He had to find her. He had to get that book. By the time Clara stepped off the bus in downtown Providence, the rain had stopped leaving the cobblestone streets, slick and shining. She pulled her coat tight against the wind and began walking south toward the waterfront, clutching her tote bag. She navigated through the bustling crowds near the Providence Place Mall, keeping her head down, her mind focused entirely on the coordinates. 41 degrees, 49 minutes, 25 seconds. North 71 degrees, 24 minutes, 14 seconds west. She was only a few blocks away. She turned down South Water Street, the salty smell of the Narragansett Bay filling the air. Clara. The voice cut through the street noise like a knife. Clara froze. She turned around to see a black Mercedes sedan illegally parked half on the sidewalk. Ronald was slamming the driver's side door shut. His face red, his designer suit, wrinkled, his eyes wild with panic. "Ronald, what are you doing here?" Clara asked, instinctively, taking a step back. He closed the distance between them in seconds, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. "Where is it? Where's the book, Boo?" "The diary." Clara feigned confusion, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I threw it in the dumpster behind my apartment. Why, you told me it was garbage." "Don't play stupid with me." Ronald lunged forward, grabbing Clara by the upper arm. His grip was painfully tight. The stocks were a trap. The house was a trap. That old witch set us up to take her debt, while she hid the real money, and she gave you the map. Give it to me." "Let go of me," Clara yelled, yanking her arm. Pedestrians began to stop and stare. A businessman with a briefcase paused, frowning at the altercation. "She was my aunt," Ronald hissed, trying to pull Clara toward the Mercedes. "That money belongs to the family. You're just a glorified maid. Give me the bag." "Clara, or I swear to God." "I said get your hands off me." Clara screamed louder this time, letting her voice carry across the street. She didn't cower. She didn't shrink. She stomped her heavy boot down hard on Ronald's expensive Italian loafer. Ronald yelped, releasing his grip to clutch his foot. "Hey, is there a problem here?" The businessman shouted, taking a step toward them, pulling out his cell phone. "Do you need me to call the cops, miss?" "Yes, he's trying to rob me," Clara yelled. Ronald looked at the businessman, then at the gathering crowd, panic flashing in his eyes. He raised his hands defensively. No, it's a family dispute. Mind your own business." Using the distraction, Clara turned and sprinted. She didn't run down the open sidewalk. She darted down a narrow, brick-lined alleyway between two old seafood restaurants, her boots splashing through puddles. She heard Ronald shout her name, but she didn't look back. She wove through a maze of loading docks and service entrances, using her knowledge of restaurant back alleys to her advantage. She finally emerged 3 streets, over chest-heaving lungs burning. She ducked into a crowded coffee shop, hiding near the back restrooms, until her breathing slowed. She waited 20 minutes. When she finally stepped back outside, there was no sign of Ronald or his black Mercedes. She adjusted her tote bag on her shoulder. The wolves had figured it out, but they were too late. The building at the exact coordinates was entirely unremarkable. It was a narrow 3-story brick structure wedged between a modernized loft apartment building and an old shipping warehouse. Above the heavy iron door, a tarnished brass plaque read, "Providence Maritime Trust and Union, established 1892. Clara pushed open the heavy door. A bell chimed softly. The interior smelled of old paper pipe tobacco and decades of quiet secrets. The lobby was lined with dark wood paneling and maritime oil paintings. Behind a reinforced teller cage sat an elderly man with wispy white hair and thick spectacles, meticulously sorting through a stack of index cards. Clara walked up to the cage. Her hands were shaking again. She reached into her bag, pulled out the hollowed-out diary cover, and extracted the flat brass skeleton key. She slid it under the glass partition. The old man stopped sorting. He looked at the key, then slowly looked up at Clara. "Name—" His voice was like dry leaves scraping across the pavement. "Clara Higgins," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I'm here for box 814. The old man adjusted his spectacles, examining her face. "Ah, Mrs. Bella Higgins's niece. She told me you would come eventually. I am Mr. Abernathy. Follow me, please." Abernathy buzzed a heavy steel door open. Clara followed him down a dimly lit narrow staircase that seemed to go deep underground, far below the water level of the nearby bay. The air grew cold and damp. At the bottom of the stairs was a massive circular bank vault door, the kind built a century ago to withstand dynamite. Abernathy spun the heavy wheel, pulling the door open with a loud groan of hinges. Inside, the walls were lined floor to ceiling with hundreds of identical tarnished brass deposit boxes. He led her to the back corner. Box 814. It was 3 times the size of a standard deposit box, resembling a small steamer trunk built directly into the wall. "The key will open the primary lock," Abernathy instructed, stepping back to give her privacy. "The secondary combination is mechanical. Take your time, Miss Higgins." Clara stepped forward. She inserted the brass key into the lower keyhole and turned it. It yielded with a heavy, satisfying click. Above the keyhole were 3 brass dials. She took a deep breath, recalling the numbers she had deciphered from Bella's garden notes. 42, 17, 35. She spun the first dial to 42, the second to 17, the third to 35. She gripped the brass handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open effortlessly. Clara let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Inside the cavernous metal box were 6 heavy canvas bank bags. Beside them sat an ornate antique mahogany jewelry box and a thick manila envelope. With trembling hands, Clara reached in and untied the thick rope binding the first canvas bag. It was incredibly heavy. As she pulled the fabric back, the dim light of the vault caught the contents. Gold. Solid gleaming bars of 18th century uncirculated gold bullion. She pulled out the mahogany box and unlatched it. Inside, resting on black velvet, were dozens of raw, uncut Colombian emeralds, some as large as her thumb, radiating a deep, mesmerizing green fire. Finally, she opened the manila envelope. Inside were bearer bonds, offshore account numbers registered in a secure Cayman Islands trust, and a final handwritten note. Clara. If you are standing in Abernathy's vault, then you proved me right. You have the grit and the intelligence that the rest of our family severely lacks. The contents of this box are entirely untraceable. The gold alone is worth roughly $8 million on the private market. The emeralds will fetch double that at a high-end auction house. Do not give a single penny to Ronald or Caroline. Let their greed be their ruin. Take this leave your old life behind and build something beautiful. Love, Aunt Bella. Clara sat on the cold floor of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than she could have ever comprehended, and for the second time that week, she cried. But this time, they were tears of absolute, profound relief. The crushing weight of debt, the fear of eviction, the years of feeling invisible and worthless, it all evaporated in the cold, damp air of the maritime vault. 6 months later, the Providence Journal ran a small, overlooked article in its financial section. Ronald Higgins, former tech entrepreneur, had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, his assets liquidated to cover massive inherited debts. In the same week, a historic, condemned waterfront property in Newport was seized by the city after its owner Caroline Higgins defaulted on municipal fines. On that exact same Sunday, Clara sat in the corner booth of the seaside diner where she had worked for 5 years. She wasn't wearing a frayed uniform. She wore a tailored cashmere sweater, sipping a perfect cup of Earl Grey tea. She watched as the diner's owner taped a "Sold" sign onto the front window. Clara smiled, running her thumb over a custom-made ring on her right hand, a flawless, brilliant green Colombian emerald. She had bought the diner in cash that morning. She had paid off the mortgages of all 3 of her former co-workers, and tomorrow she was flying to Italy. She raised her teacup, looking out the window toward the ocean. "Thank you, Aunt Bella," she whispered, taking a sip. They had laughed at her for inheriting an old diary, but Clara was the only one having the last laugh. What would you do if your family mocked you for inheriting a dusty old book, only to discover it held the key to ultimate wealth? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this story of karma and hidden treasure, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas every single week.